Здравствуйте. Thank you for coming. The lecture may be a little shorter today because I want to leave on time. But I want to talk today about a concept. I want to talk about a concept which plays a very great part in English language philosophy, but perhaps not in the philosophy of other languages and cultures. And I think that I want to talk about utility. And I think that this word, as well as having great philosophical significance in certain types of philosophy, says a lot about British culture. That is, in talking about this word, we're also talking about something that's played a very important part in the development of British cultural life. Now, the word itself, utility, is very simply defined in the dictionary as the condition or fact of being useful. And of course this tells you nothing, because then you want to know what's useful. And utility is something that has usefulness. Something has utility, it is useful. And the word use is actually an extremely complex word. And I'm not going to go into all the many possible uses of the word use. But what I want to emphasize, and this will be my conclusion also, is that any reference to usage is a normative statement. That however simply descriptive it may be to say that a hammer has a use for hitting a nail, that's actually a claim about the value of the hammer. That is, any statement about use is a claim about a value. And this is the key to see why it's important to philosophy, is that use is used as a criterion for deciding whether or not something has value. And of course the debate among philosophers has been, can you take use as a criterion for deciding whether something has value or not? There's a sheet of paper. Did you have it? I like the idea of reading your blank piece of paper. This may be the ultimate postmodern philosophical statement. But certainly, it doesn't have utility. Now, so I want to talk about the way the word has been used, its history, and then end with some criticisms of the notion of utility as a criterion for deciding on value. And this is, of course, highly politically relevant. Not political in the broad sense, it's highly relevant to your positions within an institution, present cultural, political circumstances. You can always ask, when something is said to have a use, you can always ask, for whom is it useful, and to what end? It's always an open question to ask about whether or not it is a valid criterion of value. This will be my conclusion. Now, in the English-speaking world, there is a long tradition of answering the question, what has use? And by reference to the phrase, what has use is what creates the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And this tradition of answering the question, what has value, what has use, by saying, well, it's what generates the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Is sometimes itself a definition of utility. Utility is what gives the greatest happiness to the greatest number. So this tradition of answering the question, what is useful, by the greatest happiness principle, as it's called, sometimes it's actually used as a definition of utility itself. What is utility? It's what gives the greatest happiness to the greatest number. And this tradition has given rise to a whole branch of the study of ethics in philosophy, highly controversial, deeply opposed by some people in this room, and it is a position which opposes itself to the idea of there being moral absolutes. That is, the utilitarian position in ethics is one which attempts to assess what is good in terms of what will generate the greatest happiness of the greatest number, rather than answering the question by reference to a moral absolute taken from a religion, or taken from a Kantian imperative, or taken from an Aristotelian idea of the essential good of what it is to be a person, or even opposes itself to the so-called ethical naturalism of a philosopher like G.B. Moore, who argues that there's a non-reducible natural realm of the moral that just exists. There's a realm of the moral that exists as part of nature. So that utilitarian tradition has been a great challenge to mainstream positions in ethics, in that it answers the question, what is good, in terms of a principle which is relative to the circumstances that generate happiness. That is, it answers a philosophical question about what is good by reference to the conditions that people live in this world, and the conditions that might improve their quality of well-being in some way to be defined or described. It's been a very influential tradition, precisely because it does interact with the conditions of life of people. That is, it takes a philosophical position, as it understands it, in order to have an influence, to have a relationship with the ordinary life of people. So the arguments about ethics and about the principle of utility as a criterion for deciding what is good raises the larger philosophical question of the relationship between philosophy and the world, philosophy and social life, in a particularly sharp form. And it particularly raises it because, as a matter of fact, many modern social policies have been justified on grounds of usefulness, that is, improving human well-being. Often many social policies have been put forward and defended and argued for on grounds of utility. And of course, they may be self-deceived, they may not be useful, but the argument for them has been that they are. And that tradition, that way of thinking, is of course opposed to the view that morality is precisely not to do with utility, but is to do with something other than utility, to do with some principle or ideal that is independent of usefulness, local conditions, context, or human well-being in the material social sense. So there are ethicists who say that ethics is the study of utility, and ethicists who say that it's precisely not the study of utility. That's, as you know much better than I, a continuing debate. Now, why do I say that utility is of interest? Well, a famous quote by Napoleon, that England is a nation of shopkeepers. And of course, shopkeeping is the occupation concerned with utility. It's a way of earning a living by selling to people what they find useful, or what they think they find useful, in some sense or other. So England is a nation of shopkeepers. And Nietzsche also observed, he was talking about John Stuart Mill and other 19th century figures, he referred to their philosophy as a shopkeeper's philosophy. And it's interesting to note that perhaps the most famous British Prime Minister of recent decades, Margaret Thatcher, was the daughter of a shopkeeper. And that her ways of thinking politically about using utility measured by profit as the criterion of social value could be said to be derived from the origins within the shopkeeping culture of Britain. And of course, people who use this phrase, like Napoleon's shopkeeper's philosophy, intended it negatively. That is, instead of pursuing glory by taking an army across Russia and losing all your army, you stay at home and you sell goods to other people and make yourself rich. So you contrast glory or divine mission with utility. And the great writer of the early culture of British commercial life was Adam Smith. His study of the wealth of nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, 1776, is in effect a great empirical analysis of commercial society, which in the 18th century was new. Of course there was commerce before, but the idea that society was constituted fundamentally by its commercial activity, that to understand the way that society worked, you have to understand commerce, was really explored by Adam Smith in his extremely elegant and great study, whatever you think of his economic position. So let me turn. Let me just say, it's not clear to me how you would translate utility into Russian directly. You have the Russian word utilitarist, which clearly derives from the English. You have polesnost, you have praktichnost, and vygodnost. None of them are quite direct translations, it seems to me. Now, let's talk a little about the historical background to the widespread use of this criterion of value. Of course, the background is the rise of bourgeois society and capitalism. More specifically, the 17th century, the political events in the 17th century, which created in the Low Countries, that is, Netherlands, northern Belgium, created in the Low Countries and in England, conceptions of the political process in which government was justified by reference to the interests of people or of groups of people. So that the background to utility lies in the political changes in which the interests that people or groups have is taken to be the grounds for legitimating the form of government. The contrast is, of course, with divine right theories, that somehow the government is legitimated by reference to spiritual design. And the discussions of Hobbes and of Locke in the second half of the 17th century laid the basis for modern political theories which seek to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate government on the basis of the interests that individuals and individuals formed into groups have in their being a government. And then they and others at the time tried to answer the questions by turning to the general body of natural law theory. Natural law theory is, broadly speaking, the belief that the conditions of existence created by God provide natural criteria for deciding how rightly to govern. That you can find grounds for understanding what it is right to do publicly in terms of governance by turning to the creation, to the nature of the creation. And in particular by turning to the nature of human nature, which I talked about last time. That is, in order to answer the questions, how is it right to govern, people turn to the nature of people who are subject to government. And it was then understood that people have certain natural needs and desires, which it is then the business of government to address. People have, for example, a desire to preserve themselves. The desire for self-preservation is a natural desire. We all seek to feed ourselves, to perpetuate our families. These are natural desires, which it was then argued it is the business of government to support. And you can then judge a government by whether or not it does support these natural ends. Similarly, it was argued that there is a natural desire to be sociable. You raised before the absence of reference to sociability in what I was saying. In natural law theories, it's very clear that it's taken to be natural for people to wish to share with others, to join with others. The most elementary natural human is taken to be that of the family, but the family was seen to be a prototype of larger forms of natural sociability. And so we find, for example, in the writer Pufendorf, who in 1672 wrote a book, one of the famous studies of natural law, political theory. Pufendorf, his book is entitled On the Law of Nature and of Nations. It's interesting to note the title, Law of Nature and of Nations. They're taken both to be subject to natural law. And Pufendorf wrote that his business, what he does in the book, is make inquiry into the most general and universal rule of human actions, to which every man is obliged to conform if he is a reasonable creature. What are the universal things that all people will do if they act reasonably? The answer is they will be sociable, they will seek to preserve themselves. And on this basis, it's argued, you can find common ground between people and hence structure a political system in which there is agreement rather than strife, conflict. And Pufendorf then goes on to say, this will appear a fundamental law of nature. Every man ought to promote and preserve a peaceful sociableness with others. Every man ought to promote, that is, he moves from a description of what is in human nature to a claim about what people ought to do. This is fundamental to natural law theories, to answer the question about value by finding the answer within what God has designed in creation, how God has designed creation, human nature. It's very interesting, very important for natural law theories of politics that they begin within a firmly Judeo-Christian tradition, that is, with God as the creator. And they gradually distance themselves from the felt need for a creator. And the natural law becomes built into nature rather into a creation. That is, many people have argued, they are very important to the secularizing direction of Western thought. It was a way of thinking that was able to empty itself of its original religious content, of the notion of a creation. That's an aside. Expressed in different ways. And their answer is the basis of the modern notion of utility. And their answer is that people act according to the pleasurable and painful experiences that they have. They respond positively to pleasure, and they respond negatively to pain. And Hobbes and Locke take the step of saying, therefore, what is good is what gives pleasure, and what is bad is what gives pain. That is, they turn to a theory of human nature, the pleasure and painful nature of our reactions to things, as a basis for making a judgment about what it is good or bad to do. And this is why they are such classic texts within both moral and political theory, is that lay the basis for what becomes the utilitarian argument. Hobbes was a scandal in his day. He was, almost everybody turned against Hobbes, but his arguments have proved extremely profound and powerful. By analogy to the movement of matter, being attracted or being repulsed, Hobbes understood the nature of pleasure and pain. Pleasure is like attraction, and pain is like repulsion. And just as matter, when it hits, is attracted or repelled, so he said human actions are the deterministic consequences of attraction or repulsion, pleasure or pain, or as he says, appetites or aversion. Appetite is desire for something, and aversion is rejection of something. And Hobbes straightforwardly says, and this is a very famous quotation, he straightforwardly says in his famous book, Leviathan, which is a study of the nature of government, good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men are different. That is, he recognizes at once that once you say that appetites are good, aversions bad, you have a relativistic theory of ethics. Morals are relative to what makes for pain or pleasure. And this is a scandal. It's antagonism to Christian, Judeo-Christian ways of thinking about what is good and so obvious. Now Locke was a bit more diplomatic in the way he expressed his theories. But he also treated all our sensory experience as being accompanied by pleasures and pains, and particularly by our reflections on our experience. We experience pleasures and pains. And he treated the pleasures and pains that we have naturally accompanying our experience as sensations which lead us to action. It's like Hobbes, we attempt to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But he allows for he's less deterministic, less mechanistic in his ways of discussing these questions. Locke, this quotation like Hobbes, Locke says, this also is extremely famous, that we call good which is apt to cause or increase pleasure. Apt to cause means it will cause, it's likely to cause. What we call good, what is likely to cause or increase pleasure or diminish pain. What we name evil is what is apt to produce or increase any pain or diminish any pleasure. There was very extensive discussion of moral principles, moral thought, in connection with political thought, late 17th century, for obvious reasons, given what is happening in Europe at the time. And in these discussions of pleasures and pain, and Hobbes and Locke also clearly recognise that many of our pleasures and pains are social. That is, what causes us pleasure often is the actions of other people. We live in a social world, and hence our pleasures and pains are constituted by our relationships with other people. And this is extremely important, because it leads people to argue that we are naturally, in the pursuit of pleasure, going to cause good to other people, because it will make other people do good to us. So in pursuit of pleasure, we actually do good. Because good is productive of a shared world of pleasure. Whereas when we do bad, what we create is a shared world of pain. So it's very important that this early discussion of what is good and bad, what is painful and pleasurable, is not a discussion of individuals isolated from society. It's a discussion of individuals understood to be naturally sociable, and therefore naturally experiencing pleasures and pains through their relationships with others and through the way that other people react to them. Pleasures and pains are reciprocal. They are social things embedded in the relationships that people have. So that though this thought is increasingly emphasizing the individual as the subject, as the political subject, it is still a way of thinking that treats the individual as social. The individual is not in any sense detached from the social. By nature, this individual is social, and hence discussions of good and evil are about human relationships. Now, in the context of debates about the nature of morality in the early 18th century, the Irish and then Scottish philosopher Francis Hutcheson, in an inquiry into his book of 1725, an inquiry into the origin of our ideas of beauty and virtue. By inquiry into the origin, he means inquiry into the origin of our ideas of beauty and virtue. He is one of the first to use the phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. He says that action is best which accomplishes the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. What action is best is the action which, through relationships with others, fosters a collective world, a social world, in which people seek to give pleasure to others, and hence to themselves, through doing the good. But it introduces into the English language the famous phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It's not only in Hutcheson, but this is the best known early source. And it gives rise to what is called the greatest happiness principle. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this principle sometimes defines the word utility. Utility is what gives the greatest happiness to the greatest number. That's how the word is sometimes used. Another famous contribution to these moral debates, which we talk about in our English classes in the Institute, is Bernard Mandeville's study, which is first published as a poem called The Grumbling Hive. A hive is a house of bees. The hive. And grumbling, they're complaining all the time, the grumbling hive. And it's then rewritten as a much larger study called The Fable of the Bees. And then with a subtitle that's very famous, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. That is, Mandeville introduces into the argument that the very challenging to have robbers in houses. So everybody then buys locks to put on their doors. And a whole group of locksmiths get richer. That is, the robbers, by threatening to steal, generate a new branch of the economy concerned with locks, which expands the economic well-being of the collective. So a few individuals may suffer, but society as a whole improves. Similarly, with relation to, there was then a debate about luxury. Contrast between the extremely wealthy forms of life of the few. This is also a contemporary debate for us. The vices of the few who spend their money on jewellery and on fine clothes and on fancy cars or fancy carriages. Mandeville says, well, when you look at luxury, what happens is that people spend their money employing other people, and the money then circulates. Instead of the money sitting there doing nothing, it is put to work by employing people, and the money then circulates and the economy as a whole grows. So actually the vices of all these high-living people are not vices, because they are virtues increasing the general sum of human happiness. It created an enormous debate at the time, this argument, and still it is central to modern debates about modern defences of unequal distributions of wealth. But you can see that the argument depends upon a utilitarian way of thinking. What is of value to society? It's the expansion of the material well-being of people. What actually makes for improved standards of living? It's the circulation of money, as opposed to a question about whether it is moral to display luxury or not, based upon some puritanical idea of what it is to be a good person, some notion of virtue derived from Judeo-Christian tradition. So we already have introduced by the early 18th century some very challenging arguments of a utilitarian kind, which are opposing ordinary or inherited or traditional assumptions of the nature of virtue. These debates then become the property of Enlightenment thought, which I talked about, talking about human nature. And they do so, and again Locke is the central figure. The argument of Locke about founding utilitarian arguments is that we study human nature. In human nature we find pursuit of pleasures and the avoidance of pains. And once we know what causes pleasures and pains, then we have the rational grounds for ordering society. If we know how people naturally act, how they acquire their patterns of action, their habits, from the experiences of pleasures and pains which they've had, we can then adjust the world in which they live. so that they act more in a way that benefits other people, that increases general happiness, not just their own. And this is a central enlightenment principle. Learn from human nature so that we can change the conditions of life to improve, to advance human well-being. Now, in discussion of this enlightenment way of thinking, two broad traditions within thinking about utility development. And these are phrases developed, and these are phrases that it's useful to know. Some people are committed to what is called a natural identity of interests theory, and other people are committed to what is called an artificial identity of interests theory. I'll just briefly try and describe these two alternatives. The natural identity of interests theory argues that we naturally work together for the good of all. And we do this because it's essential to our own individual happiness that other people are happy too. That is, we increase our pleasure by making other people happy. Our pleasures are a response to other people. And this kind of assumption, which you find in Locke, and you also find in David Hume, the philosopher. Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature. Note the title of his main philosophical book. It's A Treatise of Human Nature, of 1739 to 40. Is famous for its sceptical arguments about knowledge, about the limits to what we can definitely know. But it is strikingly not sceptical about our passions. That is, he takes it for granted as unquestionable that we have certain natural conditions which include pleasure and pain, and that these natural aspects of our experience lead inevitably to us doing good to others. Because of our natural sociability, we wish to share the world with others, and by sharing the world with others, we find inevitably that we wish to increase the pleasure of others. And about this argument, Hume is not sceptical. He takes for granted certain foundations of human nature in the passions. At the same time, he's questioning the foundations of our knowledge and our reason. It's very interesting. Similarly, in Adam Smith. Adam Smith's famous for his book on the Birth of Nations, but earlier he was a teacher of moral philosophy. He was appointed as a professor of moral philosophy. He never refers to anything called economics. He wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, in which argues that there is a natural human capacity for sympathy. All people show sympathy, according to Adam Smith. It is natural, it's part of human nature. By sympathy, he means an ability to share the feelings of others. We look at others, we react to others, we share the feelings that they're having. And therefore, because we have sympathy, we share other people's pleasures and pains. And so, because of sympathy, we do good to others to increase their pleasures and pains, and hence to increase the pleasures and pains that we feel by sympathy. There is a natural identity of interests between ourselves and other people because of the natural existence of sympathy in human character. And note how this kind of argument still plays quite an important part, I think, in many people's everyday, informal assumptions about the relationships with people and what holds society together. That there is some kind of natural sympathy. It gets transmitted in later nationalist versions into a view that you have sympathy with certain groups to which you belong and antipathy towards other groups. Of course, lots of variations, but in the Enlightenment thought of Adam Smith, it's universal. You have sympathy to everybody. Though he recognises degrees, of course, people closer to you have more sympathy. The argument for the natural identity of interest is then developed to its extreme in the classic of the early political theory of anarchism. And this is the work of William Godwin in the 1790s. In 1793, Godwin published a book called Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. And in youth government, people will naturally work for their own interests and the interests of others. They will, because of their natural sociability, work together to create forms of social arrangements, order, which satisfies their needs. And that the problem with society is not lack of government, but government itself. That the source of disorder is the attempt by government, which represents certain interests, to impose themselves on others. And if you leave people alone, they will naturally work in ways that increase their happiness by joining in, creating collective social projects. William Godwin, interestingly, was married to one of the great pioneers of feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft. In the 1790s, represent the extreme leading edge of radical thinking. It's interesting to see how this very radical thinking grows out of Enlightenment tradition with its own roots in Judeo-Christian natural law theory. Now, that's another broad trend of belief in the natural identity of interests. By contrast, there are those who say that actually, as a matter of fact, we can see that individual interests do not always act for the happiness of others, and they have to be made to act for the good of others. And this was a more individualistic approach, recognising that individuals are less naturally sociable, don't naturally show sympathy for others. And this is developed in particular by two writers in the second half of the 18th century, this way of thinking. In France, by Helvetius, whose book on man, De L'Homme, was only published after his death because of its radical content. Helvetius is the Enlightenment thinker who does believe that all people are created equal, literally, at birth, and that everything about human difference is caused by experience. And for Helvetius, everything depends upon education. And hence, if you wish to create an ordered society, if you wish to increase happiness, if you wish to create virtue, what you have to do is control education. And through education, you can make people what you wish. You can make them virtuous. And of course, conversely, we might think you could make them evil. Famously, Helvetius says, to emphasize the importance of education, he says there is no idiot servant girl, no idiot girl whom love does not make clever. That even the lowest person he can imagine in society, the idiot servant girl, becomes clever when it's in her interest, that is, when she can get happy by being clever in pursuit of love. She will become clever. Now, Helvetius's thought, and his language and arguments enter into the Constitution of the American Republic. He's writing, published early 1770s, since the American War of Independence and the Declaration the American Constitution, which is the most radical political document in many respects. But this way of thinking of the artificial identity of interests was systematized, made systematic by the English writer Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham is really the key figure in the story of utilitarian thought. Firstly, it is Bentham who introduces the word utilitarian. The word utility exists from the medieval period, but utilitarian is Bentham's word. It's an occasion you can actually find who introduced it. He defines utility as a concept, and he then says that once we accept utility as a criterion of what is good, then we see that what is needed to create a good society is to reformulate its laws. As Bentham turns to the legal system as the means by which to impose a systematic pattern of pleasures and pains on people. That people will know what will give pleasure and what will give pain because they live within a legal system that makes sure that if they do good to others, they are rewarded, and if they do bad, they are punished. And he publishes his book in which he develops this argument that it's through legal reform, changing the legal system, creating a rational legal system, called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published, interestingly, in the year of the French Revolution. That is, we're not talking about arguments which are detached from major events. In the year of the French Revolution, Bentham publishes his book, which systematized an attempt to rewrite, to create a new legal system on systematic grounds that would ensure that people act for the common good and punish those that don't. It is an argument for codification of the laws, and it is taken up in France in the new Napoleonic Code of I forget the exact year, 1803, 1805, 1803 I think. And the Napoleonic Code is then the model code that is followed by other legal systems, including the Russian. And the idea of having a legal code is based upon utilitarian arguments. Instead of just having traditional legal laws based upon tradition or upon the decisions of the sovereign, you have a system that is based upon knowledge of what will lead to increased happiness and what will direct people towards actions which increase that happiness and away from those that don't. Bentham is a very, he's a figure who, because he took his arguments so seriously, and was so dry in the way he expressed his own importance, it's very easy to laugh at Bentham. But his arguments seem to me to lie at the basis of a great deal of modern social and ethical thinking. He was a foreigner who was elected a member of the National Assembly, of the Radical Assembly in France after the Revolution. And he went on, as well as inventing the word utilitarian to describe himself and people who followed his ways of thinking. He went on to invent two other things which have remained famous. And in his language, the first was called the philosophic calculus. A philosophic calculus means a calculus for happiness. What is philosophic is what creates happiness. And he tried to turn his arguments into quantitative arguments. He started to provide measures of what it is, of the degree to which particular actions increase the general happiness. If you believe you have a criterion of value for deciding what is good, it's clearly of use, has utility, if you can quantify that value. And one might say that the modern discipline of economics has precisely done this, but what it has done is take a large sectors of society which it has constantly expanded, and imposed upon those sectors of society a form of thinking which permits the quantification of utility. In economic terms, this utility is what generates wealth, profit, capital. Just come back to that in a minute. But Bentham is the origin of modern cost-benefit analysis. That is, of the dream that it is possible to create policies, to take decisions on the basis of rational calculation. Bentham also introduced the panopticon. The image made famous in the writings of Michel Foucault about the history of punishment. Panopticon is an image of governance, of governing people by having an eye at the centre which constantly observes what people are doing and constantly acts to push people towards pleasure and away from pain. So it's the all-seeing eye that constantly controls, constantly directs the circumstances in which people live so that they move towards actions which create the good and away from those which create the pain. And embodied in architecture, the panopticon was Bentham's design for an ideal prison, in which at the centre of the prison there is an observer who looks at all the prisoners to ensure that all the time they are they constantly observe the prisoners so that the prisoners themselves learn to observe themselves and to see that the actions which have brought them to prison have led to their own unhappiness. And the actions which will leave them from prison are those actions which will lead them to act in socially responsible ways. And you can see the results of this ideal in the actual architecture of prisons. Recently in St. Petersburg, and if you stand by the Smolny Institute and look across the river, there is a low red brick building which has several wings spread out like a star. In the centre there is a central tower. And in the central tower the guards can stand and watch what is happening along the corridors of each of the wings of the prison. And this architecture is directly indebted to Bentham. And its architecture is dependent upon an imagery of the eye at the centre that is constantly and rationally observing individuals so that they learn the habits of good social behaviour. What actually happens in prison is, of course, the opposite, but the ideal is embedded in the architecture. And the modern prison constructions were built according to utilitarian principles. Many of us might think that it's great failure. this was the idea. Now, I want to jump from Bentham briefly, and I apologise for the briefness of this, because there are so many dimensions that might be talked about. I want to talk just briefly about some modern dimensions. It's very important to note that the utilitarian arguments in the 18th century and the 19th century were often the vehicles, the motor of reform, of progressive reforms. When you contrast the kinds of society that people like Bentham or Helvetius were arguing for with the existing conservative, reactionary nature of government, one might see that the utilitarians are on the side of reform. You recall Foucault's famous example at the beginning of his book on punishment. He begins with the imagery of the regicide, the attempted killer of the king in France, being punished by being torn apart by 4 horses. That's only the small part of what happens to him. He is tortured systematically before he's killed. This is 1750s. Bentham proposes, says that is not useful, it does nobody any good. It's punishment which responds to desire for primitive revenge. Instead, we should have punishment which stops people doing bad things. And what punishment will stop people doing bad things is punishment which teaches them to reflect on their sources of happiness and the sources of pains in their lives. So firstly, I want to associate utilitarian arguments with progressive and reformist arguments. Find the same among the Russian reformers of the 1860s and 70s. Utilitarian arguments play a role. The introduction of the legal code, the Napoleonic Code, was seen to be progressive. It replaces a body of laws grown up by tradition, which represent the interests of kings and aristocrats, with a body of laws founded on reason and the pursuit of collective happiness. This is the argument. And arguments for utility were central to the discipline of political economy, out of which we get modern disciplines of political theory and economics. And political economy through the 18th century, Adam Smith, through Ricardo, Marx, in the early to mid-19th century, discusses economics in terms of a criterion of utility. What is it that generates wealth? The concern is not with happiness, but with wealth within political economics. And utility is formulated in economic terms. What in commercial society is it that has utility by generating wealth? And classical economics, the economics of Smith and Ricardo and of Marx, argues that it's labour. The source of wealth, the source of utility is labour. And that is then changed in the English-speaking world in the 1870s by what is called the marginalist revolutionary economics, with the argument that it's not labour that gives value, but utility itself. And utility can be measured by what people pay. That is, the marginalist revolution puts in place a form of economics which is quantifiable because it takes the price that people are willing to pay as a measure of the value that something has. Value, utility is measured by price. If you can get a high price for something, it has that high value. And just remember the contrast with medieval economic thought, in which there was the notion of a just price. Something has a natural price, a just price. And that, by the late 19th century, has been completely overthrown in dominant forms of economics. Value, and so you get an economist like Jevons, who worked in Manchester, one of the architects of the so-called marginalist revolution. He said, value depends entirely on utility. It's worth, he's talking in economic terms, price terms, value depends entirely on utility. But it's worth taking the same phrase and thinking about it within the context of philosophy. Value depends entirely on utility. Similarly, John Stuart Mill said, what we produce is always a utility. Labour is not creative of objects. This is interesting. Labour does not create objects, but utilities. That is, we should be concerned in our analysis of social order, not with the things that we have, but with the use that things have. And the use can, according to economists, be measured by the price that people are willing to pay for it. And what one can see in recent moves, political culture, is the movement of these economic arguments out of the sphere of economics narratives understood into the social sphere generally, particularly into medicine, education. Forms of argument that appeared appropriate within business, judging the value according to the utility that something has, have been transferred from the business sphere to other aspects of society, medicine and education. Along with the arguments. So that the long background which I've been trying to describe about the notion of utility is in many respects working itself through the whole of ways of politically organising the Western Russian social world in the present. So I think here we have a case in which the historical story is extremely pertinent to present politics. Now, if you'll excuse me, I want to end, and I will leave fairly quickly, though there's much to discuss. I want to put some problems to you. I've been talking about utility. Just let me begin by saying, all is not a bed of roses in the garden of utility. I can mix my metaphors. Firstly, you adopt a criterion of utility, something that is useful. It still leaves open debate about what is useful. And any debate about what is useful is a debate about ends. And we can, of course, debate whether the criterion of utility that people actually have, how much does it cost, is what is useful. If you take a strongly religious perspective, we say that this debate about utility in material terms is not really about what matters, what is of use to the human soul. That is a judgment that utility is restricted to certain material dimensions of life is a judgment, is itself a value assessment, which can be questioned. So that whatever your arguments about utility, it still leaves open the possibility of debate about ends. The second point is that all debates about utility, all statements that something has utility, are statements about something having utility for somebody or for some group of people. And you must and I would say must always ask utility for whom? Who in fact benefits from the development of utilitarian arguments in education? Is it the students? Is it the teachers? Is it the bureaucrats? Or is it the politicians? Who benefits? That is, statements of utility are always statements about power. And I think they should always be clearly understood as statements about power. When people in English often refer to the real world, they mean the world of earning a living, making money. And we can ask, whose interest is served by an argument that says the real world is the world of making money, as opposed to the world of walking in the countryside, having a cup of tea. I mean, okay, I'm making very simplistic, but I think very important points. The third problem about utilitarian theories concerns the issue, is it possible to quantify qualities? That is, in what sense is it possible to quantify happiness or virtue? And I would say that the question, is everything that exists, does it exist in some measurable form or not? There are people certainly who argue this. There's a psychologist, American psychologist called Thorndike, who argued, he said something like, everything that exists in some measurable quantity. Is this or is this not true? And I would say such a quantity is fundamentally about metaphysics. What is the nature of being? But you can see the interest that certain groups might have, bureaucracies might have, with making the claim that everything that exists is measurable. Because then it puts them in a position to take rational decisions about what to support and what not to support. So I'll end by reading you a poem written by a young woman writing about Bentham. So it's a poem from the early 19th century. She was called Helen Bevington. I don't know anything else about her, but she was bright. She said, they say he cherished, talking about Bentham, they say he cherished men, their happiness, and then calmly, as seemed one could, devise cures for their good, believing all men the same, and happiness their aim. He reckoned right and wrong by felicity, by felicity lifelong, and by such artless measure as the quantity of pleasure, for pain he had a plan. Absurd old gentleman. So I'll finish there.